Welcome to our X space. This is Jamal Abdi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to take some time to discuss the topic of whether President Donald Trump and Iran can strike a nuclear deal, or as Trump referred to it just last week, a verified nuclear peace agreement. So we're going to talk about how Tehran has reacted to Trump's rhetoric around the deal, a potential deal. What does sort of the back and forth look like? What elements of a deal would need to be addressed, and what is the leverage that the parties have to strike a deal? Now, if you want to ask a question, please just send a DM to the NIAC account, the @NIAC Council, or you can email us at info@niaccouncil.org, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's questions in the second half of the space. So joining us first at the top, we have Ryan Costello, the policy director of NIAC. We have Kelsey Davenport, who is the director of Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. We've got Barbara Slavin, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. And we have Trita Parsi, the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and was the founder of NIAC. So let's start things off. I kind of want to pose this to everybody, but let's start with Trita and maybe Barbara to weigh in on just where things currently stand, because we came into this administration with a candidate, Donald Trump, who seemed to talk about Iran a little differently than he had during his first term and in the lead up to the first term. He was, as far as we have deduced, the only candidate, major candidate on the campaign who actually talked about a deal with Iran and negotiating with Iran. And even when reporters asked him about alleged assassination plans against him by Iran, Donald Trump said he still wants to negotiate because the alternative would be unimaginable. So with all that being said, he did last week sign a memorandum to put maximum pressure back in place. And we can talk about whether maximum pressure ever left. It's notable that this was not an executive order. And when he signed it, he said he didn't want to sign it. He didn't want to have to use the maximum pressure sanctions, and he instead wanted a deal with Iran. That, though, was met with some, I'd say, not too positive rhetoric from the supreme leader in Iran, the president of Iran over the weekend. And there have been some efforts to dial back the opposition to diplomacy, or to say that it is still on the table, even when some of the supreme leader's words seem to indicate it was not on the table. But so with all this having happened and where things are right now, Trita, do you want to tell us, where do you think things are going? What is the current state of things?
You're quite right. This is definitely a president who went further than anyone else in expressing a desire for a deal, which, of course, given what he had done to destroy the previous deal, we obviously have to perhaps have a degree of skepticism around. But I think it's nevertheless fascinating that he had so many different opportunities to say the things he said before, say that, the JCPOA was the worst deal ever, blame everything in the region on Iran. Instead, he was actually very disciplined, kept on saying that his only red line is nuclear weapons, rejecting regime change, did not talk about regional issues or some of these other concerns that some of his close friends in the region have, but really zeroing that only nuclear weapon is his red line, and then expressing clearly that he would like to see a deal. The problem we're facing right now, I think, is that the discrepancy between what he was saying and what he is saying to what was in that memo is quite significant. And given the context in which the Iranians, on the one hand, are very distrustful because of Trump pulling out in the past, but also because of their past experience in seeing that even though Trump may want a deal, he has plenty of people around him, and he still has people around him that have no interest in a deal and are far more interested in pushing maximum pressure to its logical conclusion, which is a military confrontation. And the memo that he signed, even though he said he didn't want to sign it, it has clear fingerprints of those elements who are still there, even though he did fire Brian Hook, even though he didn't bring in Nikki Haley or Pompeo or others into the his White House, there are still people who share those views and have influence because they are in the National Security Council. So that memo is completely different from everything he's been saying. So if you're sitting in Tehran, their concern is, is this once again a situation in which Trump wants a deal, says the right things about a deal, but ultimately he cannot deliver on it because his national security is against it, his National Security Council is against it, and they will continue to sabotage any genuine efforts for diplomacy as they did in the last year of his first term. Secondly, even worse, is this an effort by Trump to get the Iranians to come to the table, only talk about nuclear weapons being a red line, but once the talks begin, expand the agenda to include the things that were in the memo? For instance, the memo was talking about getting rid of all of Iran's ballistic missiles. It was talking about what it called the terrorist networks having to be completely dismantled. Things that really remind you of the 10 or whatever points Pompeo had, which clearly was designed to make sure that there could never be any real diplomacy with Iran. So they're concerned and looking at this and thinking, okay, he may be saying that he wants diplomacy, he says the right things, but once at the table, what's the guarantee that the agenda suddenly will not expand to things that from the Iranian perspective are non-negotiable, are not on the table? And this is what I think is the key driver as to some of the backtracking from the Iranian side. There's also, of course, a concern that despite a lot of positive signals being sent between the two sides publicly, there is still not an envoy appointed by Trump to handle this issue, which means that even if there is a strong desire on the Iranian side to start some communication, who do they start it with? I'll stop there.
Barbara, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah,
Do you share that view?
I do. First of all, thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it. It's great to be with such good company. I'm going to start where Trita left off. I think the Iranians are eager to start a process, but they are very much waiting for an Iran envoy to be named. And it's not Steve Witkoff. There was a fusion over that with an answer to a question, but it's clearly he's got his hands full trying to maintain the Gaza ceasefire. There is a structure. It's called the JCPOA structure, and it still exists. The Iranians have now met twice, I believe, with emissaries from the E3, Britain, France, and Germany, who are part of a joint commission set up by the JCPOA. They are waiting for the U.S. to name an Iran envoy who would then be allowed to sit in on those conversations. The Iranians, at least the ones I'm talking to, seem to want to use that framework while it still exists, to begin the process of talking about what comes next, whether there are remnants of the JCPOA, longer, stronger, different, whatever. So this is the key roadblock now. I mean, there's no point in the Iranians continuing to meet with the Europeans if there's no Americans sitting in the room. And I think they're willing to have that American sit in the room, despite the fact that the U.S. withdrew in 2018 and reimposed sanctions. The other thing I think that's really crucial is what happens to the ceasefires in the region. As long as there's not active shooting going on, it's propitious for discussions to begin with Iran. If Gaza if the ceasefire collapses there, if the ceasefire collapses in Lebanon, that makes it more fraught and more difficult for Iran to sit down again and talk about its nuclear program. On this memo, I'm not so concerned about that. I don't think Trump cares really about what's in the language of these things. He's much more interested in sort of the nitty-gritty of negotiations. This is an opening bid. And I think it was ICBMs that were prohibited, not all missiles. There was some other language about missiles. And as far as dismantling terrorist networks, well, I mean, the Israelis have done a pretty good job of decimating the axis of resistance. So in a way, that's also, kind of answered this demand and makes it propitious for talks. But we need to see an envoy. So, Trump needs to decide who he wants to talk for him on Iran.
How long do you think this window is going to be open? I mean, how urgently does Trump need to put an envoy in place before things go the wrong direction?
It's urgent. We need to start having some meetings soon. I mean, the framework, such as it is, goes away Or does it? Let's see. Next October, the UN Security Council is no longer seized with the issue. And the possibility of snapback goes away. Snapping back UN sanctions that were suspended by the JCPOA. I mean, I think it needs to be within the next month or so.
Let's talk about the so I mean this is important. The public pronouncements of the president are one thing. The sort of institutional process filling in where the president's words end and action needs to start is not necessarily there on the US side. And the president is saying, really narrowly focusing on no nukes. That's what the deal has to accomplish. We have to be convinced that Iran's not going to build nuclear weapons, and that is how Trump has described it. And then you have this memorandum that, as Trita said, does go into other territories about support for militias and terrorist groups, ballistic missiles, ICBMs, things of that nature. I think that it's important to look at the other timeline, the nuclear timeline, and sort of what Iran is doing on that front. So, Kelsey, can you tell us a little bit about where things are on the nuclear side? Obviously, Iran has accelerated its program significantly since the United States left the JCPOA, and Trump says that Iran is too close to a nuclear weapon. So what steps has Iran taken that raise concerns, and how close, quote unquote, are they to this, point of no return that Trump alludes to?
Thanks, Jamal, for hosting this. It's great to be with everybody, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. I would flag three fundamental differences in Iran's nuclear program now as compared to when Trump withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal in May of 2018. And since then, Iran has embarked on a number of activities that really have brought it to the threshold of nuclear weapons. I mean, perhaps, most concerningly, Iran has invested in new capabilities related to uranium enrichment that allow the country to much more quickly produce the fissile material for a nuclear weapon if the political decision is ever made to build the bomb. I mean, specifically, Iran has invested in new, more efficient centrifuges. This allows Iran to enrich uranium, much more quickly. It also has experimented with higher levels of uranium enrichment, and it's mastered the production of uranium enriched to 60%. Now, 60% material can technically be used for a nuclear weapon. It's unlikely that Iran would go that route. They would probably enrich it to 90%, which is considered weapons grade. But when you take this higher level enrichment, the stockpile of 60% material Iran now has in country, it's more advanced centrifuges. If Tehran made the decision to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons, they could produce enough for 5 to 6 weapons in under 2 weeks. That's just the material. Weaponization would probably still take another 6 months. But that's quite concerning that Iran could move that quickly. And a lot of the knowledge Iran has gained from these capabilities, cannot be fully reversed. So we will have to contend with a future where Iran is going to be closer to nuclear weapons given these knowledge gains. I think the second key change is that there are some critical monitoring gaps that have emerged over the past few years because Iran has significantly limited International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. Inspectors have not been to key facilities that support Iran's nuclear program, like the places where it produces centrifuges. And because of this, I think there are real questions about whether or not the IAEA can verify that all of Iran's nuclear activities are peaceful and that all of the material remains accounted for. This plus, the IAEA visiting some of these sites less frequently, really raises the concern that Iran might try to divert materials to a covert program. And it raises concern that Iran could attempt to produce material for a bomb in between inspections. And so taken together, this knowledge plus the gaps really raises concerns. And then the third thing I would flag really has developed, in 2024 is a shift in discussions about Iran's nuclear doctrine. Now, the U.S. intelligence community, I think, continues to make clear that they don't see a political decision from Iran to develop nuclear weapons, and there's no resumption of key weaponization-related activities. But prominent Israeli or Iranian policymakers have said, time and time again that Iran may rethink its position on nuclear weapons if security conditions change, if nuclear facilities are attacked. And this type of socialization, I think, increases the risk that a political decision could be made to develop nuclear weapons in the future. So all in all, from a proliferation risk perspective, it's a very concerning time, and there is a real risk that Iran is going to cross the nuclear weapons threshold.
So the nuclear side, if we're assuming there are negotiations focused solely on the nuclear issue, this is sort of Iran's leverage. On the U.S. side, Ryan, what is the leverage that currently exists? What is the state of maximum pressure? Did maximum pressure ever leave? What is potentially coming on board? And then what could potentially be eased as part of an agreement?
Sure. So starting with the maximum pressure, what Trump has signed is in some ways a continuation of the Biden policy in terms of keeping sanctions in place, going after different designations of different Iranian industries and oil sector and so forth. A lot of that is continuing, but there are some novel elements in it, and I think this is some of the signaling that Iran picked up on is going beyond the Biden sanctions to potentially revoke any sanctions waivers that benefit the Iranian economy at all. Potentially encompassing things like humanitarian items, food and medicine. Certainly, Iran derives some degree of benefit from that, and that is potentially on the cancellation block in the months to come. Another big novel element is this call to drive Iranian oil sales back down to zero. That is literally, what Pompeo was trying to do in the State Department back in Donald Trump's first term. And then three, it is to work with key allies to complete the snapback of international sanctions and restrictions on Iran. This is presumably a reference to the possible snapback of United Nations sanctions resolutions on Iran, which Iran has threatened to respond to by withdrawing from the NPT, which certainly raises the risk of weaponization and loss of any form of inspections inside of Iran. So what leverage does the U.S. have? I think this is a really key point. Two buckets have been tried before, been in various deals before, and then there's a third bucket that would be a bit novel that Donald Trump seems, possibly well situated to pursue. So the first bucket is this restricted assets abroad. So whenever Iran, does trade and oil sales with a variety of countries, a lot of that money gets deposited in financial accounts that Iran has very limited access to. So the prisoner swap back in 2023 that freed Siamak Namazi, it involved this convoluted operation to move Iran's money from South Korea to Qatar, and then Iran was supposed to be able to draw that money down to spend on medicine and so forth. They never were able to do so. The October 7th attacks happened very shortly thereafter, and the Biden administration responded to pressure in Congress to freeze those funds and make sure that they don't go forward. So there's tens of billions of dollars held abroad. This is something that's been in various deals with Iran at various points in time and so forth. The second bucket is secondary sanctions, so allowing others to trade with Iran. Trump could renew oil waivers and so forth, essentially allowing other countries to benefit. This was a big part of the JCPOA, the big, kind of carrot to get Iran to roll back its nuclear program. The third bucket that's never really been tried is the primary sanctions, so the U.S. embargo on Iran. And going back to 2015, one of the key Trump complaints about the JCPOA was that it did not allow the U.S. and Iran to do any business, and that's a valid complaint. He saw all of these other countries doing business with Iran and inking deals and so forth. But U.S. firms, with the exception of Boeing, were basically blocked out from the Iranian market. So that really didn't jive with, kind of Trump's vision of doing deals and business with countries around the globe and so forth. So I think that is an area that Trump could explore that Obama didn't, and it could be a win-win. So you ease sanctions, allowing U.S. economy to benefit, and then you secure some security concessions from Iran. It also could go a long way to kind of help normalize this notion of sanctions relief. So there's a lot of ways to go if you're the Trump administration, a lot of levers that can be pulled. I think a real challenge, though, is that this sanctions web is extremely convoluted, and it's pretty hard to pull back, one thing and ensure Iran gets benefit on the other side. Iran has this experience of signing up for major relief back in 2015, and it was never really delivered in a sustainable way. And in fact, the last time that this was tried, it really opened up the Iranian economy to some pretty significant sanction shocks back in 2018, with the Iranian economy really being hit hard with the sanctions reimposition and so forth. So it makes sense to a degree for Iran to be cautious about going back and kind of re-exposing itself to the sanctions pressure in a way that would be very concerning for Iran's leadership. So Trump has to get over that skepticism, and I think that comes to his positioning and his actions going beyond just his rhetoric.
So this raises issues of, I think, some of the political constraints on the U.S. side, but also raises questions about the sort of regional. This is the elephant in the room. It's not even the elephant; it's the room itself. So the region, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of, there are special envoys from the U.S. engaging different parties in the various crises, and so I think I pose this question to everybody. But how have the regional dynamics changed? I think most would say that the regional dynamics actually have improved in terms of Iranian relations with Saudi Arabia and its Arab neighbors. On the other hand, we've got these crises across the region, and so we're talking about four-dimensional chess and the notion of solving just the nuclear issue without it being connected to all these other issues that are being dealt with. Things get very complex. So what do people think about the role of the regional crises, and how things may be different this time around than they were in Trump's first term or when the JCPOA was first struck, with regard to the role of other regional players?
Can I jump in, Jamal?
Yep.
So I think first we have to recognize that when Trump first put in maximum pressure back in 2018, and the regional dynamics back then, even though it was a very risky and dangerous move, in my view, ultimately backfired, the runway from maximum pressure to an actual conflict was much, much longer than it is today because of the regional dynamics. You already now have a region that is essentially on the brink of explosion. Talk about this ethnic cleansing of Gaza and pushing them into Jordan and Egypt is just going to make everything so much more volatile and dangerous. For the Jordanians, this is essentially an existential issue. So, and on top of that, of course, you have what is going on in Syria and elsewhere. All of this is really making it much, much more dangerous to, pour gasoline onto the region by doing maximum pressure right now. On the other hand, I think it's also interesting because Iran's regional setbacks also makes the regional dimension in terms of being part of the negotiation less of an issue. Before, there were a lot of complaints by some of the other actors in the region that the United States did not do enough to push back against Iran's regional position in Lebanon, in Syria, or elsewhere. Well, a lot of that is already done now through the warfare, mainly what the Israelis have been doing. So it's unclear to me that will be as big of a sticking point. Now, of course, some of the regional players may want to push matters much, much further, and truly corner Iran and make it much weaker. But I'm not so sure that they need this nuclear arrangement, that needs to be part of the nuclear arrangement. The Saudis are already maneuvering quite effectively to position themselves much stronger in Lebanon at Iran's expense, of course, in Syria as well. So a deal between the US and Iran on this issue doesn't seem to have as much of a direct impact on this as it did before, because now many of these countries have other avenues and other developments that enable them to advance their positions vis-a-vis Iran. But of course, there also raises the issue I think Barbara addressed briefly earlier on, which is if Trump is going forward with some very, very problematic movements in Gaza, which really just amounts to war crimes and ethnic cleansing, how does that affect the Iranians' willingness to make a deal? And what's interesting so far is the messaging out of Iran has not in any way, shape, or form tied nuclear talks between the US and Iran to what is happening to the Palestinians.
Barbara,
Yeah.
what is your take on the regional side of things, and also with the fall of Assad and talk of how weak Iran is has also potentially influenced policymakers and sort of the judgments of what's possible. So, how has this influenced the process or the
Yeah.
potential process?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the optics are very difficult for Iran if all these wars start up again, but I still don't think it's impossible for them. I mean, the rial has now, the Iranian currency has continued to depreciate at such an enormous rate. I think it's like $1 million to the dollar now. It's insane. Iran desperately needs sanctions relief. And, I think that there is still a way for these talks to commence. What I'm worried about is that, Trump's tendency to beat his chest and to humiliate folks, but he seems to mostly be interested in humiliating American allies, not American adversaries, at least so far. So, it's necessary to sort of, if there is going to be any accommodation, to make it look somewhat respectful. And we've seen comments from him. He talked about Iran being strong, not weak. I thought that was interesting, part of his negotiating gambit. But yeah, obviously, if the region can remain relatively calm, it helps. I mean, the Houthis have stood down. They're not attacking shipping, for example. The Hashd Shabi, the militias in Iraq have not been attacking Americans. And of course, the situation in Syria means that they've been kind of pushed away from that conflict. So I think it's really imperative to start the exploratory talks, whether it's through the Joint Commission or through some private contacts, while this lull in fighting is going on.
As a reminder, everybody, feel free to submit questions. Just DM the NIAC account that's the host of this event. If you'd like to take a look at what the diplomatic processes look like so far, we have a diplomacy tracker on our website, www.niacouncil.org/diplomacy, where you can see all of these signals and memorandums and everything that has been done over the past several weeks, going back into the campaign, actually, towards potential diplomacy. So we talked about sort of the region. What about Europe? I mean, is Europe relevant to this process? Is there a role they're playing? Are these talks that Iran is having with Europe of any import, or is this a new game and it's all about the U.S. and the region engaging Iran, and Europe is no longer as relevant of a player?
Can I jump in just for a sec? I think Europe is a placeholder. But at the same time, Iran is a stickler for agreements that it has already reached. And, it does provide the format, the space for an American to join. And then the talks can go from there in some other direction. I mean, this doesn't mean there can't be informal conversations, but, who would be the emissary? I mean, I've been reliably informed that Elon Musk never met the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, as was reported some months back. So, there have been some unofficial contacts by folks with Iran, but the key is to get an authorized channel of some sort, and the Europeans are useful for that. I mean, they do have a very important way to enter this in terms of snapback. The United States is not party to the JCPOA anymore, so it can't snap back sanctions. This is the one tool that's left to show international displeasure, even though it does bring risks, as Trita pointed out. So I think, we should use the tool while we have it. The problem again is that the U.S. is so busy antagonizing Europe with tariffs and so many other gestures that one wonders, whether the Europeans are able to compartmentalize the Iran issue and still be useful on this. But it's worth testing.
I differ a little bit from Barbara on this issue, in the sense that I don't think the US or the Iranians are looking for any mediator on this issue. They're both looking to be able to deal with this directly, which means that whatever help they may get at this stage from the Swiss, from the Omanis, from the Qataris, they're looking to use that as just a phase towards them talking directly with each other. And I suspect that they will cut everyone out, that this will be a US-Iran deal, that's the preference of Trump, and just do a deal from a US perspective. He'll listen to some of the others, presumably, but he's not going to rely on them for this negotiation. And I think the Iranians are also reached a point at which they no longer want mediators. Europe, in that regard, is the least useful one, I think, from both sides' perspective. I think there will be, at least the Iranians will be careful not to antagonize the Europeans unnecessarily because of the snapback leverage that the Europeans still have for the next couple of months. But the Europeans did not deliver on their end of the bargain. And since 2015 or since 2017, when they failed to continue to provide the economic benefits that the JCPOA more or less obligated them to do as part of the deal, the Europeans have become even more dependent on the United States and even less capable of charting an independent role. So the idea that they would play the type of a role that they played before, which even then was proven to have been more ambitious than what the Europeans actually could deliver, I find that very unlikely. That doesn't mean, however, that a final deal necessarily will be against the interests of the Europeans, but this will be likely an avenue in which their diplomatic utility more or less has, if not come to an end, nevertheless diminished significantly.
Can just
So,
reply quickly? I mean, this is
yeah.
something that was raised with me by Iranians. So I think it's more in terms of sort of format structure. The content itself, who knows? And of course, the U.S. can and the Iranians can peel off and do this on their own. But simply as a way to sort of get the process moving again. That's the only thing.
So, I mean, it makes sense it makes sense to me, the Iranians and the Americans should engage directly. But as we know, that has been a challenging process to set up. As of now, sort of mixed signals publicly on the Iranian side about whether they would engage directly with the United States. So is that the prevailing view, that Iran is eager to engage directly, and that's not going to be the obstacle? We had, of course, under Biden, the tales of negotiations that were the Iranians would give a message that would then be passed to the United States, and it sounded like a very cumbersome process. But that was, the Iranian decision, because they wanted Biden to just come back into the JCPOA, didn't want to have a negotiation about it necessarily. But is that the view, that obstacle is going to be overcome and the Iranians are going to negotiate directly with the United States? Or how possible is that?
I think it is going to be overcome. I don't think it has been fully overcome yet. But when you listen, for instance, to what Arakchi was saying a couple of weeks ago, in which he also said that a New Deal would not necessarily be within the framework of or based on the JCPOA. I think there were some clear signals then that the JCPOA framework, which was part of the justification for not talking to the American side directly because he had exited it and they wanted to re-enter it, they're not looking for the American side to re-enter the JCPOA at this point because they also understand that at this point the JCPOA has essentially expired. Doesn't mean that the next deal will be fundamentally different or anything like that, but if the demand no longer can be that the U.S. has to re-enter the JCPOA before there can be talks, and also having learned from the experience that it was a huge mistake not to engage the U.S. more directly earlier on, I think it will be overcome. However, I think we're in a worse situation now compared to just 10 days ago because of these latest statements, the memorandum. I'm not so sure that it's particularly wise to talk about how the Israelis will bomb Iran to smithers or whatever the expression was if there isn't a deal. I don't think that type of approach is going to be particularly successful. And I think it's very fascinating that Trump seemed to have recognized that because he went out of his way not to do the usual trash talk that he does before he wants a deal. I thought it seemed to me that he had come to the realization that at least in this context, in this relationship, because of the history, that's not a good approach. And he stuck to it up until just a day or two ago.
Um, I think I'd like to talk about what is in the realm of possibility for an agreement on both sides. And so I'd like to hear from Kelsey about the sort of nuclear side, what is possible, what's doable. But I'm also curious, do we think that regional issues, whether it is support for proxies or even, um, what is happening in Syria, what is happening in Lebanon right now, are those completely off the table? Are those going to play any role in negotiations? Is there a possibility that they are discussed on the sidelines and there is some informal detente that is struck? Or I think, Barbara talked about, there haven't been these attacks from these Iranian so-called proxy forces. Are we going to just sort of live in this state of limbo on those things with kind of a informal, just the sides keeping tensions down? What's possible? Is it possible that these things could actually be negotiated, or is this off the table?
Sure, I can start, Jamal. So first, your question about the regional situation. I mean, I think one thing we've seen in the last year is Iran attempting to use its threshold status, so its ability to move quickly to nuclear weapons, to deter attacks against its territorial integrity. And I think this goes to the point that Iran's nuclear program, its ability to develop nuclear weapons, is part of its security doctrine. Now, I don't think that it is wise to try to tackle regional and nuclear issues in one deal combined. I think the complexity of that type of negotiation runs the risk of failing to reach an agreement before the Europeans trigger the snapback, which would likely happen, in July, so it would be in place before the expiration in October. But I think it would behoove the United States to support regional security dialogues and rapprochement at the regional level in order to try to help sustain and reinforce a nuclear agreement. The nuclear agreement is going to be more sustainable. It's going to be more durable if Iran feels like it does not have to resort to using its threshold status for security purposes. So I think having a more comprehensive strategy is a more sustainable way to approach this issue, even if it's not sort of a grand bargain or connecting the regional and the nuclear, within one negotiating context. In terms of the nuclear agreement itself, given Iran's nuclear advances, I think the onus really needs to be on stringent monitoring of the program. And because of the knowledge Iran has gained, because of its ability to quickly, ratchet up its program in the future, ensuring that any movement away from its declared nuclear program is quickly detected, that the IAEA can deter Iran from trying to divert material, all of this is crucial. So the IAEA is going to need, much more intrusive access to Iran's nuclear program, in addition to Iran taking steps that roll back some of the most proliferation sensitive activities. There's going to need to be a rollback in enrichment level. Iran is going to need to refrain from significantly ratcheting up its number of installed centrifuges, and in addition to that, more intrusive access. But just as importantly, I think any nuclear deal should try to shift the prioritization and focus of Iran's nuclear program. Iran has poured billions of dollars into this uranium enrichment program that really provides little to no civilian benefit and really doesn't advance civil nuclear objectives in Iran. But if you look at where Iran, has invested in other areas, like nuclear applications for medical isotope production, nuclear applications for agriculture, these are areas where, further investment, further support of civil applications that have, no proliferation risk, could really help kind of redirect Iran's nuclear program and demonstrate the value of maintaining a peaceful program, and again, demonstrating the costs of deviating from that. So trying to redirect the program while limiting the proliferation sensitive activities and more intrusively monitoring that, ideally combined with shifts in the regional environment that require Iran to rely less on its nuclear program as a deterrent. I think all of this would make for a more sustainable architecture going forward.
And then how does that, how does that intersect with the politics? I mean, both inside of Iran, how doable are these moves? But also, how does a President Trump sign an agreement like that and sell it as better than the JCPOA that he withdrew the United States from? Is there something on the nuclear side or in terms of the sunsets that you think he would be looking at, or are we largely looking at a similar deal and maybe there's something else that makes it the better deal?
Well, one thing I think to keep in mind, Jamal, is I think the comparative goalposts for nuclear agreement have shifted. This isn't, the Trump first term where any deal was going to have to be better than the JCPOA. I mean, the basis of comparison now is President Biden's failure to reach any agreement with Iran. So, any deal that rolls back the program, enhances monitoring, even if it's not technically better than the JCPOA, is going to be sold as a success because Biden is going to frame it in comparison to, Trump is going to frame it in comparison to Biden's failure. That being said, I do think it would be wise to, try to make certain aspects of the deal permanent. Some of the more intrusive monitoring, for instance, that should be permanent. Iran should not object that it's being singled out if the IAEA is implying the same intrusive framework that the vast majority of states in the international system have already accepted. Iran has, no real need at this point for enrichment, above 5%. A limit there in perpetuity, or perhaps, an agreement, maybe 20 years down the road to revisit the issue if Iran's technical needs change. That could be a way, say, for, Trump to say that, he got something, better, if he does indeed need that metric. But I think the bottom line is that if Trump wants a deal, if Trump has a nuclear deal, from a political perspective, I think he is going to force this through Congress, and he is going to ensure that it's implemented, irrespective of the specific, non-proliferation criteria.
Could I add one thing? I think Kelsey is absolutely right in many of these different aspects, but I think it's also important to understand beyond comparing it to Biden's failure, Trump is going to compare it to a completely different standard. The Obama administration was adamant to only use a scientific nuclear metric to determine whether this was a good deal or a bad deal. Did not want to talk about any other aspect. This was a national security issue because of the necessity of preventing an Iranian pathway to a nuclear weapon. Trump is going to talk about the sanctions that he's going to be lifting that is going to enable American companies to go into Iran. He's going to talk about the jobs this will create for the American economy, for the American manufacturing industries, etc. Things that the Obama administration would never touch, that they didn't even want to, include in this conversation. So I think Trump's ability to cast this as a success, even if some of the nuclear aspects are weaker than what was in the JCPOA, I think are quite unlimited. And I would point to one thing. It's been quite fascinating to see that there's not been any real pushback on the right from Trump's talking points about wanting to have a deal, not liking the maximum pressure memorandum, all of the different things that he said that the Democrats usually view as being politically extremely costly, has cost Trump so far nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point and speaks to the fact that the high watermark for support for a deal under Trump in Congress is much, much higher than it would be for a Democrat, because basically a Democratic administration striking a deal with Iran, virtually every Republican is going to vote no, and there's going to be a sizable percentage of the Democratic caucus that's very aligned with AIPAC and others that is also inclined to vote no. So you're talking most of the time a minority of support for a democratically struck deal. Under Trump, you could probably assume that the vast majority of the Republican caucus will not oppose Trump, going along with the deal. In fact, maybe rapturously in favor of it. And then I think you add to that, a large percentage of the progressive caucus among the Democrats who look at the range of issues that we're facing as a country and say, well, if Trump is moving us away from war with Iran, I support that. I supported it under Obama, and I'd supported it under Trump. So I think creates a pretty wide open lane for Trump to negotiate and do some things that the Democrats shied away from, as Trita was alluding to with the primary sanctions.
There's the big issue of trust, which we've talked a lot about on the U.S. side, a verifiable nuclear peace deal. But trust on the Iranian side is not very fulsome. What can or what do you think the expectations are from the Iranians on the U.S. to actually agree once again to limit its nuclear program? Are there any additional? I mean, Trita talked about some of the economic opportunities for the United States, but what sort of measures do folks think potentially need to be baked into a deal to guard against, for the Iranians, the possibility of the United States abandoning the agreement once again?
Can I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be very difficult to establish trust in the sense of the two sides actually immediately trusting each other. But they may be able to better trust their own assessment of what the other side's interest is and what the forces in favor of continuing the deal will be, given what a new deal likely will look like, which I suspect will, from Trump's perspective, will be very important for him to make sure that he opens up the Iranian market to American businesses, not just for Chinese and Europeans. And once you actually have American companies in Iran, then you suddenly have a completely different force that will favor a continuation of a status quo in which the U.S. doesn't go back to sanctions and the U.S. doesn't withdraw from this deal. There really wasn't any of that with the JCPOA, with the exception of one Boeing deal, which the Emiratis essentially replaced, because as what appears to have been a exchange, the Trump administration walked out of the JCPOA and more or less simultaneously, the Emiratis put in a major order that would essentially replace the money that Boeing would have gotten from the Iranians if they had gone forward with that deal that was part of the JCPOA. So I think the trust will potentially come because there will be a new structure that will have many other elements who have a continued interest in the implementation of the deal, which wasn't the case with the JCPOA. Once Obama was out of the picture, once that major political force of a president favoring the deal was gone, it fell apart rather quickly because there really wasn't that massive infrastructure of other elements, other interests that wanted to see this deal continue and who had the ability to push for it.
Can I add something, Jamal?
Yeah.
During the Iran negotiations with the Biden administration, a theme that came up was Iran wanting its own guarantee essentially on regarding U.S. sanctions lifting, and some of the things that were discussed on the Iranian side were keeping some of the 60% enriched material in Iran. I don't think that any good deal should allow Iran to keep that material. But what Iran does have is the knowledge that it's gained about these more proliferation-sensitive activities. So Iran also can ratchet up its nuclear program, much more quickly, if the U.S. were to, pull out of the deal and again, quickly try to restore sanctions pressure. So in terms of, the ability to kind of quickly retaliate, to try to restore leverage, I think the steps Iran has taken, put it on, a more equal footing with the United States in terms of being able to kind of revert back, if an agreement is violated. Of course, ideally we don't see that scenario, but I do think that provides a little bit more sort of that guarantee that Iran is looking for in its ability to quickly reconstitute its nuclear program.
Can I add something as well? I think if we can embed an agreement in some sort of regional understanding, that will also help. Whether there can be some, peaceful nuclear cooperation between Iran and its Arab neighbors, create this infrastructure that Kelsey was talking about in terms of peaceful use. There has always been talk of an enrichment bank, a multinational facility. I don't know how feasible that is, but of course we know the Saudis want to have their own enrichment. Why can't they have some conversations with the Iranians about how that's done in nuclear safety if it's done under the rubric of an agreement? Limiting Iran's ability to produce weapons. I think we have to be imaginative and, to use the Trump phrase, out of the box a little bit on this, so that any agreement that is reached has some more foundation to it besides just the U.S. having to certify every 90 days that Iran is in compliance.
I think this will be the last question that we got from the audience, but questions about the situation inside of Iran, both the human rights situation as well as, civil society and, the Islamic Republic is obviously in the midst of a crisis of legitimacy. What are the prospects of an agreement for its impact inside of Iran? Where do we think both the human rights situation, the political situation, what impact will a potential deal or even negotiations have inside of Iran? What is, what are the opportunities? What are the drawbacks, if any?
Maybe Trita can add to this, but, I think history has shown that when people are under less economic duress, they actually have more energy for civil society and for protests. The sanctions have, hurt ordinary Iranians so much and enriched the most corrupt elements of the elite. I think one has to be clear that any nuclear deal is not any kind of affirmation of the goodness of the Iranian government. Far from it. It's a very practical way of ensuring that Iran does not become even more threatening to the region and to U.S. interests. And it should be presented that way. Human rights advocacy is extremely important. Unfortunately, I don't think the Trump administration is going to be doing much of that anywhere. But we all need to continue to advocate for Iranian human rights, to protest unjust executions and jailings. And I don't see that this in any way interferes with also getting a nuclear agreement.
Yeah, I'll add, and I think Barbara said it very well. What we've seen on the human rights situation throughout maximum pressure is a worsening of the situation with some really brutal crackdowns, and I don't really see a pathway for maximum pressure continuation to produce a better result on the human rights front. In fact, it's very and increasingly likely to potentially lead to a war between the U.S. and Iran and Israel that would be extremely devastating for the human rights situation and everybody inside of Iran. In terms of what a deal can accomplish, we did see economic reprieve, including under the very limited window of the JCPOA implementation, where inflation went from about 35%, 40%, down into the single digits. And that did make a difference in the lives of ordinary Iranians. Now, flash forward back to maximum pressure. We've got a lot of Iranians really struggling, cutting meat out of their diet, falling into poverty. We've got a lot of issues in Iranian society, for sure, with power outages and pollution here in the winter months and so forth. And, economically, there isn't really a lot of solution to a lot of these real big problems, absent some degree of sanctions relief and so forth. So I think it's an issue that we will continue to track and continue to monitor this, widening gulf, I think, between Iranian society and the state. We've got our human rights tracker and other resources, and where there are avenues to advance the human rights situation, we'll definitely be interested in taking those.
Could I just add, I strongly agree, and also want to point out that throughout all of these different things, sanctions relief has actually been strongly supported by the Iranian public. The protests outside of Iran on Mahsa Amini tended to be somewhat different from the protests inside of Iran. The protests outside call for more sanctions and call for Iran to be kicked out of the World Cup and things of that nature. That's not the message I think we saw from inside the country, from the protests or from those organizing. And I think particularly now, given how much the situation has gotten worse, and also with how the real, as I think Barbara pointed out, has really nosedived after some of the negative comments coming out of the Iranian supreme leader. I think it's a stark reminder that some sort of a deal is needed just to be able to meet people's need for a decent livelihood, and from there on, opportunities for pushing back against the repression of the government will be in a much better shape than it is under circumstances in which people are starving or simply don't have any bandwidth to be able to do anything else but to try to make ends meet.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We're going to leave it there. As a reminder, make sure to follow the NIAC Twitter account, the X account, for the latest updates. At our website, you can also sign up for Iran Unfiltered, which is our weekly tracker of events inside of Iran, as well as our human rights tracker. And that's at www.niaccouncil.com/HRT. We're going to have some busy weeks ahead, so please stay tuned and stay engaged, and we will be tracking and working on this issue in the meantime. All right, thank you, everybody. Until next time, take care.
Thank you so much.